Good afternoon. Appreciate the opportunity to lead this great panel where we'll be looking at the current investment landscape in youth sports. Fortunate to be joined by Ryan Bays, co-founder and chief executive officer at Youth Inc., Sheik Sanankoa, who is founder chairman of Omega Sports Holding, and Drew Weatherford, who's founding partner of Weatherford Capital. Gentlemen, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having us, Todd.
Thank you.
We thought a good place to start would just to look at the trajectory of youth sports, particularly from the participation standpoint of a youth sports athlete, just to understand how it has evolved. Drew, maybe we could learn a little bit more about your personal journey in youth sports and what it was like being on the player side and now on the investment side, how you've seen the evolution of the space.
Sure, yeah, thanks, Todd. Well, first of all, it wasn't just my journey, it was my journey and the 8 siblings that I share. Kind of big family, all of us played sports growing up, and we actually all played Division I sports, which is quite unique. Yeah. So it's quite a household of chaos. When I think of sports, I kind of break it up into 3 different buckets. I think of sports as recreation, I think of sports as education, and I think of sports as entertainment. When I was growing up, the other 2, sports as education and entertainment, almost like didn't exist. It was just recreation. We played sports partially so that our parents had a break. It was like babysitting, partially to have fun. And yes, would we learn some lessons, while we were doing it, was the world that I grew up in. Now where I feel like we are is in a place where parents realize how important sports are to the development of their children, not just as children, but becoming adults. And you're just seeing their willingness to invest more and more time, energy, and effort into that education. And so I think we're kind of morphing from sports as recreation, now more as sports as education. And even in youth sports, you're starting to see a little bit of blending between education and entertainment. So it's quite a large, when you think about it from an education standpoint, it's a $1.5 trillion TAM is what you're thinking about. And I really think parents are viewing it more through an education lens than they are anything else.
And Sheik, obviously you bring a very unique perspective, both with your experience from the international side and obviously the exposure here domestically. So how do you see that from the international side and the evolution of youth sports, particularly in the international markets?
Yeah, that's a very good question. There is a very wide spectrum of what you see. So on the one hand, you have the example of Norway where youth participation is north of 90%. I think in the US, youth participation is closer to 50%. And if you look at across registered students in Africa, it's 20%. But informally, outside of the school system, it's closer to 70%. So there's different models that you see. And I think the US is very unique because it's one of the few markets where we've been able to keep amateur sports and pro sports tracks for youth under the same umbrella. So, if you're a high school student, a middle school student, you can still go to school normally and play sports at a very high level. Now you have programming that happens extracurricularly to complement this, but the bulk of it is still within the traditional economical system and education system that you have. Internationally, what we've seen is you have 2 tracks. You have the amateur track that's mostly extracurricular, and for people and kids that are in kind of the pro track that are supposed to be pros, then you have the academies, right? So you see it a lot in tennis and in soccer, where very early, by the time kids are 13, 14, then, a decision is made that they go to these academies that are boarding school, where they do go to school a little bit, but really they're training, 6, 7, 8 hours a day to be professional. So that has created a whole set of opportunities. And today what we're trying to do is try to bridge the gap. And on the one hand, continue to have kind of these pro tracks, identifying talents, trying to train them without sacrificing the education they need to get, and actually merging that a little bit with the amateur track, which is giving a lot of opportunities in kind of the plays that we're doing right now.
Really insightful. Appreciate that. And Ryan, obviously from the Youth Inc. standpoint, a core part of the mission is improving the overall experience for the player, the athlete, the communities, the families. What does that mean in terms of how you live out that mission?
So it really started back in 2022 when Greg started You Think as a podcast and a passion project. He had retired from 14 years in the NFL and stepped into coaching youth sports. His kids were 8 and 10 at the time, 8-year-old twins and a 10-year-old son. And I think the experience that he had in youth sports, that I had in youth sports, that Drew talked a little bit about, was very different than what he was experiencing as a dad and as a coach. And Greg's the son of a legendary high school football coach in New Jersey, and he said, if I have all these questions about how to navigate the landscape and what teams I should participate in and when my kids should specialize, then there's got to be millions of other families that are feeling the same way. And so he took it on himself to record 44 episodes in 2022 with sort of a who's who from across the youth sports ecosystem: professional coaches, athletes, world-class sport psychologists, and parents. Like Cooper Manning and Lisa McCaffrey were 2 guests that had just lived through that with Arch and Christian and all the McCaffrey boys. And I came across that when I was working for Fanatics and leading a project on behalf of the enterprise, looking at the market, and was really, inspired by how Greg was viewing it. And so we're building a business at the intersection of media and commerce, but the media side of it is free now and always and mission driven, and we really hope that it is not a singular source of truth, but an asset and a vehicle that people can look at, whether you're a parent, a coach, or an athlete, and say, these guys are having the most important, impactful conversations about the youth sports ecosystem on our platform.
Love it. And Sheik, as you think about Omega Sports and kind of the investment landscape, has youth sports always been a focus on that, or what's been the evolution of youth sports being a part of your overall portfolio?
Yeah, youth sport is really at the core of what we do. There's 3 key concepts: youth sports, value chain, and ecosystem. So there's 2 sports that we focus on right now. You have basketball and soccer. And each one, we worry about the whole value chain. And in this value chain, we try to figure out where are the pinpoints and where we need to operate. And sometimes it means that you need to own and operate in part of this value chain, and sometimes you need to be facilitating this value chain. And that's why, for example, in basketball, we take the full view. So we started by investing in the largest and most successful club in Côte d'Ivoire that won 19 of the 25 championships over the last 25 years on the men's side, and 10 of the last 15 on the women's side. So dominant club. So you start by that, and then that had a pro track to successful youth that we think could be pros. And then from there, we decided to also invest and sponsor an existing academy in the market for amateurs. And then that became kind of a feeder program into our pro program. And then what we did is, because we also have a foundation, then the foundation started renovating and investing in courts across the city and the country, and funding individual kind of macro academies. So, with $1,000, $2,000, you buy equipment, you fund these programs, and that kind of becomes the bedrock as well for feeder for some of these academies. So, that's kind of the way we've started to look at it. And then the second property we invested in was in Europe, because as we create these talents in Africa, then trying to create a bridge for these talent to be exposed to Europe and be able to then later on create a track to maybe go to the US, etc. So this gives you a sense of how basically the talent management has always been at the core of what we do.
And Drew, so Weatherford Capital started in 2015. Correct me if I'm wrong. Initial investment thesis was not focused on sports, correct? But over the last couple of years, that has been now part of the portfolio. Why is that, and what did you see about the landscape that expanded kind of your perspective?
Yeah, well, that is correct. For the first, call it 7 years of our firm's history, it's myself and 2 brothers that actually started the firm, which is kind of unique, all of which played college sports, which I mentioned. So the passion was always there. We just never really saw an entry point, frankly. We weren't going to be minority stakes guys in NFL teams or MLB teams, or so we thought. I'll get to that in a moment. But what we did have was a lens into what was happening at the collegiate level. And so our kind of sports investment thesis was really looking through the lens of what was happening in college sports, which was changing and still changing quite rapidly. I serve on the board of trustees at Florida State University, and my brother serves on the board at USF in Tampa. And so having played and been on the board, and we were watching private capital circle, college athletics, but more importantly than that, I was seeing how difficult it was becoming to get into a decent school. When I went to Florida State University, I think the average SAT was like 1,200, and now it's 1,380, right? And so the value of like a seat
It's still
in
out of
college.
1,500?
What's up?
It's still out of 1,500, the SAT?
Oh, yeah. I think so. There's been some inflation there. Kind of hard to track. But it's two things. One, the roster spots on the collegiate side have become so valuable because there's really money now in sports in college. So that's one thing. And two, most parents don't think their kids are going to go pro. And I know this from being on the board at IMG and being an investor there. 80% of those parents are just using sports as a pathway to get to college. It's just a way to differentiate yourself in a college application, right? You might not have a 1380, but you have a 1250 and you're a really great soccer player. All of a sudden you find yourself at Vanderbilt. And so that's why I go back to this like education piece. I really think parents are so focused and one, getting their kids into good schools. And two, also the data would say, I think it was Ernst & Young did a study that 94% of executives that are females played sports all the way through high school. And they almost earn 10% more than the average woman does in the workforce. I attribute that, and I think the data would, to sports. And so kind of looking at it top down from, Florida State, from IMG, we just realized that there was a great opportunity, not only to make great investments and make money, but we think there's a need to just rationalize the ecosystem, which is flawed here in the U.S., and honestly, I think other parts of the world actually have it better with academies and more kind of vertically integrated systems.
And Drew, you mentioned the investment in IMG Academy. Congrats on that. Congratulations on the Tampa Bay Rays recent investment. Obviously, two very different organizations, or are they not? I mean, just curious, as you've looked at both of those under the hood from an investment standpoint, maybe similarities and differences in those processes.
Well, IMG makes a hell of a lot more money than the Rays do. As many of you guys know, the MLB has a labor issue, so a lot of teams don't make that much money, to be completely honest. Two very different assets, for sure. Very different profiles. The one thing I'm most excited about that we're working on currently is in baseball, that's not the Rays, is we've actually launched a de novo roll-up strategy of elite clubs in baseball. And so think about, buying 30 to 40 of kind of the most elite clubs that are out there, commercializing them, and frankly, trying to organize them into a league. Because Sheck and I have talked about this, but the way that the U.S. is organized with these clubs and this tournament infrastructure sucks as a parent, frankly. I mean, it's like if you want your kids to play competitive anything, you got to travel 10 times a year to all these tournaments. When you think about how many great baseball players and how many great baseball teams there are in Florida, like, why do you have to leave Florida but like a couple times a year, right? So our view is that if you can actually build a league, which I think will happen in a lot of sports, where it's kind of a segmentation of kind of the most elite travel sports, there'll be kind of mid-tier, and then there'll just be recreation for fun. That's what we're trying to build in baseball.
And Ryan, would love your perspective from You Think standpoint. I know there's been some recent seed funding. Congratulations on that. So being on the other side of the table and seeking investment, what have been some of the key points, and as you've had those conversations, making sure investors are aware of the youth sports space?
When we started the investment process or fundraising process in early 2024, the industry was starting to heat up, but I think there weren't conversations at investment summits like this about youth sports as an asset class. So there was a lot of explaining what the TAM is and how it breaks out and where the opportunities lie and all of those things. And I think that's a lot more understood now than it was a year and a half ago. But it's an interesting asset class, like taking, I guess wearing either hat, operator or investor. Like, despite being a venture-backed entity in this market, like, I don't know that it's a great market for venture investors. Like, everyone knows that it's extremely fragmented, that the addressable market's 40, 50, 60 billion, whatever you want to, label it as. I don't think anyone really knows. But I do think it's a really good investment class for growth equity and probably for middle market, private equity and roll-ups, much for what Drew was talking about. Like, we're in conversations with clubs, streaming platforms, digital ticketing companies, like all of these types of entities every day, whether that's through the lens of media or commerce. And there's immense room for improvement operationally, from the early technology companies that were invested in 10 plus years ago to the litany of mom and pop operators that are not terrible businesses when you look at them even in a vacuum, and they could be a lot better if they were actually run a little bit more professionally. And I think that that's there's obviously been so much noise about private equity coming into this space, and some of it's warranted, but I think the biggest opportunity is to realize a lot more value in this ecosystem, because there's just so much inefficiency across the market.
And Sheik, what about internationally? Who's running a lot of tournaments internationally? We're talking about the organizers of youth tournaments here domestically. Similar landscape internationally, different?
Yeah, I think you have to think about it in terms of sports. So maybe if we think about soccer, so you have kind of a landscape of academies. So you have a lot of them in Europe, you have a lot of them in Latin America, you have them in Africa, and you have these circuits and these tournaments that happen that allow them to kind of showcase the talent, right? And to have measuring sticks, and that's where you have all the scouts that come in. And these tournaments are actually very, very important, right? Because when you think about the value chain, again, you need to be able to identify talent, have a philosophy around how you want to train that talent, have the infrastructure around it, have the fuel and the working capital to fund it, and then your distribution, right? Because if you have this talent that you cannot showcase, then you're not going to be able to have them reach their full potential. So that's like kind of a very critical piece in soccer, in how basically you see the transition. And FIFA has done, I think, a great job in kind of mapping it out. The kids, they have to stay in their country until they're 18. It's when they're 18 that they're able to be transferred. And when they're transferred, that's when you kind of see the maturation process.
And let's spend some time just on current trends in terms of the investment landscape. And Ryan, I'll start with you. If this was a 4-quarter game, if you will, where do you think we are in terms of quarters with regards to, are we still very early on in the trajectory here? Are we towards the end of the game? Are a lot of folks already in the asset class? And what trends are you looking at?
I would say, I don't think we're in the first quarter, I think that would probably be like the easy answer, but I actually think we're probably more like the second quarter. Yeah. I think that this started to become an investable asset class. You started to see that with Bain and KKR and some of the early investments that not just them, but others made in the early 2010s. And there's been a decent amount of venture capital that's come into the space for some of the platform or operating systems companies. But I think those investments have allowed for little pockets of aggregation, and it makes a business like ours a lot easier to go and have strategic partnerships. I also think it's, as I said a couple minutes ago, I think that there's going to be a lot of consolidation, especially as macro M&A markets open up. We think a little bit more, that there's going to be some really good companies, I think, built in this market over the course of the next decade.
And just real quick to wrap up on the YouThink business specifically, how's the e-commerce business coming? Where are you all at with that journey and that rollout?
Yeah, so we still early. I mean, we closed our seed round of fundraising in April of 24, and we've spent the last almost year and a half building commerce platform infrastructure. Most of our team is from Fanatics. So we spent a lot of time looking at the nuances in the supply chain and how we built the cloud commerce platform at Fanatics and what's different about this market. But we launched back in August, and we're live with about 1,000 high schools.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And a few hundred travel clubs. And we'll continue to grow that, hopefully quickly, over the course of the next few years.
Impressive growth in a quick amount of time. Congratulations. Drew, what about you in terms of trends that you'll be having your eye on in the space and where you think we are in the arc?
I think it's sports academies. I think there's going to be a vast proliferation of sports academies throughout the country. There's obviously great examples of that overseas. IMG is a really interesting kind of 40-year story to get to where it is, where now it's 1,600 students. There's 16 different sports being offered. But the interesting thing about a sports academy, I think there's a lot of people that have dreamed about building sports academies. The issue historically, and what's now making it possible, is the education piece, right? A coach may have had this idea, and many coaches did for a long time, but to actually be able to deliver the pedagogy to be able to move a kid from 4th grade all the way through 9th grade or all the way through high school was just a really heavy lift. And now with a lot of the technological advantages we have and there's online curriculum, it's becoming a lot easier to provide. I'm not saying it's the best education or it's the best method of education, but you can get a real education online, which is enabling a lot of these individuals that would love to start sports academies the ability to do so. So I'd say that's one. On the regulatory front, there's 20 states now that have what they call ESAs. I don't think New York's one of those, but if your kid doesn't go to public school in Florida, no matter what you make, you get $8,000. And you can do whatever the hell you want with that $8,000. You can homeschool your kids and hire a trainer. You can use that for private school. So there's 20 states around the country that now the money truly follows the student, which is just going to give parents more flexibility to be able to make these types of decisions. And so I think there will be multiple IMG campuses, nationally and globally at kind of the highest end of the value chain. But I also think you're going to see, private schools spin up that want to just focus more on athletics. I actually think it'll go all the way down to clubs, and there are already some like soccer and baseball and basketball, literally club teams that are also providing education. I wouldn't necessarily send my kids to that school per se. It needs to be vetted out and proven out. But I think sports academies are going to be all over the place in this country.
In the example of the $8,000 for Florida, is that per year or is that across the
per year per student?
Interesting. So, Sheik, from your standpoint, trends that you'll be watching?
I'm going to take a slightly different angle here. I'm going to think about geography and where the source of talent is going to come from. So to me, the next 20 years, I think we're going to see that Africa has become the key battleground for identifying talents for all the major sports. And, when you think about it, about a third of the youth today is in Africa. That's about 700 million kids. If you compare it to the U.S., you have about 73 million kids today in the U.S. Fast forward to 2030, that number is going to go to 750 million compared to 76 million in the U.S. So when you think about, and then that number is going to go to 40% by the time you get to 2050, right? And so if you think about the population and potential talent that you have access to, then you're going to have a disproportionate amount of that talent that exists on the continent. So really, the big question is, if there's enough investments that's made both on the hardware and the software, and I think that's where it links back to the point around the academies. How do you kind of create all the infrastructure around amateur and pro talent? And with the globalization, technology, etc., you can be in the middle of any country in the world today. If you're talented, then you will be able to be surfaced. So I think that's going to be a very, very interesting evolution. Obviously, this is a biased and self-serving argument because it is part of our strategy, but we truly believe that being able to invest right now, will put us in a position to deliver the just Giannis, the just Joel Embiid, to the NBA. And, some of these major leagues, I've seen the writing on the wall. And the earlier panel, the NBA mentioned what they're doing in Africa. The NFL is doing the same, where it's with the flag leagues or the NFL going and recruiting directly in these countries. I think right now there's about 140 African players in the NFL. out of the 1,695 or 96 players that they are, right? So it's quite significant, and this trend is only going to go one way.
Gentlemen, appreciated the insights, appreciate the discussion. Thanks so much.